They called him Grandpa when they slapped the cuffs on. A proud black man, 73 years old, standing silent in that cramped courtroom while people whispered and pointed like he was some kind of spectacle. The white officers who arrested him smirked as they led him to his seat, treating him like just another troublemaker who'd finally been caught. What they didn't know, what nobody in that room understood, was that this quiet man had once ended a siege with a single shot from over 1,000 yards away. And the only person who knew the truth about Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Washington was already driving toward the courthouse, wearing 4 stars on his shoulder and carrying a weight of gratitude 30 years in the making. When you find out who this man really was, you're going to be shocked. If you believe that respect should be earned through character, not assumptions, hit that subscribe button. This story delivers the most powerful moment of recognition you'll see all year. Mobile, Alabama had always been a city where appearances mattered more than truth. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like curtains hiding old secrets, while gleaming courthouse steps promised justice that didn't always deliver. The morning sun barely touched the Gulf Coast when Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Washington arrived at the Riverside County Courthouse, his weathered hands steady despite the chains that bound them. At 73, Samuel carried himself with the quiet dignity that only comes from a lifetime of service. His hair was silver white, cropped military short, and his dark eyes held depths that most people were too uncomfortable to explore. The scars on his knuckles told stories nobody bothered to ask about, and the slight limp in his left leg spoke of battles fought in places most Americans couldn't pronounce. People in Mobile thought they knew his type, another angry old black man who couldn't let go of past grievances. He lived alone in a small apartment near the shipyard, walking the same route every morning at 0500 hours, his back straight, his pace measured. Neighbors saw him as eccentric at best, potentially dangerous at worst. None of them knew that Samuel Washington had served 4 tours with SEAL Team 6, that his hands had steadied a rifle scope in the mountains of Afghanistan, while American lives hung in the balance. The courthouse had seen its share of injustice over the decades. Built in 1963, its marble steps had witnessed protests, victories, and too many defeats to count. Samuel had walked those steps as a young man protesting for civil rights, never imagining he'd return decades later as a defendant in chains. His military record was buried in classified files. His service medals sat in a shoebox in his closet. His Purple Heart had been earned when shrapnel tore through his leg during a rescue mission that saved 12 Marines, but the only people who remembered were either dead or had moved on with their lives. To the public defender assigned to his case, an overworked young woman named Lisa Chen, he was just another elderly defendant who refused to explain himself. The charges were simple: disturbing the peace and threatening behavior at a downtown gas station. The victim, a 28-year-old white man named Derek Phillips, claimed Samuel had threatened to take him out during an argument over a parking space. What Phillips didn't mention was that he'd been harassing the elderly black gas station attendant first, and Samuel had simply told him to back off. Samuel never defended himself during questioning. He answered yes or no when required, provided his name and address, and sat in that jail cell with the same steady calm he'd maintained during firefights in Kandahar. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ask for help. He just waited, watching the system work the way it always had, knowing that sometimes truth takes its own time to surface. The courtroom filled slowly that Tuesday morning, mostly with curious locals who'd heard about the crazy old man case on social media. Officer Bradley Mills, the arresting officer, sat confidently at the prosecution table, adjusting his tie and checking his phone. He was 34, clean-cut, third-generation law enforcement, the kind of cop who'd never questioned whether his badge gave him the right to make snap judgments about people. Mills had arrested Samuel without hesitation, believing the story Derek Phillips told about being threatened by an unstable veteran. He'd seen the type before, older black men who thought their military service gave them special privileges. Mills had served 2 years in the National Guard and considered himself an expert on veterans who couldn't adjust to civilian life. The prosecutor, District Attorney Margaret Foster, reviewed her notes with practiced efficiency. This was supposed to be a simple case: elderly defendant, clear witness testimony, routine conviction. Foster had built her reputation on maintaining order in the community, and that meant dealing firmly with troublemakers regardless of their background. Samuel sat silently between his public defender and the bailiff, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He watched the proceedings with the patience of a man who'd spent countless hours in similar situations, not as a defendant, but as someone who understood that justice and truth weren't always the same thing. "He looks dangerous," one juror whispered to another. "You can tell by his eyes." They didn't see strength, they saw threat. They didn't see honor, they saw defiance. And Samuel heard every word, adding it to the weight he'd been carrying for decades. Derek Phillips took the stand wearing a designer suit that cost more than Samuel's monthly pension. His father owned 3 car dealerships across Mobile, and Derek had never met a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. As he settled into the witness chair, his lawyer, a private attorney his family had hired to ensure justice was served, nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Phillips," District Attorney Foster began, "please tell the court what happened on the morning of October 15. Derek's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never been doubted. "I was getting gas at the Chevron on Government Street when this old man started hassling me about my parking. I was in a legal space just trying to get to work, and he comes over acting all aggressive." Samuel's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. His public defender, Lisa Chen, scribbled notes without much enthusiasm. She'd tried to get Samuel to explain his side of the story, but he'd just shaken his head and said, "Some fights aren't worth having, ma'am." "What exactly did the defendant say to you?" Foster continued. Derek leaned forward, playing his part perfectly. "He said he could take me out from 1,000 yards without breaking a sweat. Said he knew how to make people disappear. Then he started talking about what he did overseas, how he was trained to kill." Derek's voice cracked slightly for effect. "I've never been so scared in my life." The jury shifted uncomfortably. One woman shook her head in disgust. Another man whispered to his neighbor, "These old soldiers, they snap sometimes." What Derek didn't tell the court was that he'd been screaming racial slurs at Jamal, the 60-year-old gas station attendant, demanding faster service and threatening to get him fired. He didn't mention that Samuel had simply walked over and quietly told him to treat people with respect. And he certainly didn't mention that when Derek had gotten in Samuel's face, challenging him to do something about it, Samuel had simply stepped back and said, "Son, you don't want to test an old man who's got nothing left to lose." "Did you feel threatened?" Foster asked. "Absolutely. You could see it in his eyes. He was dangerous. Military training or not, that man should not be on the streets." Samuel watched Derek's performance with the detached observation of someone who'd seen real actors in real danger. He'd watched enemies lie before, but never in a place where truth was supposed to matter. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his life protecting people like Derek Phillips, and now Derek was trying to destroy him with manufactured fear. In the gallery, a few people nodded along with Derek's testimony. They saw what they expected to see: a young professional man threatened by an unstable veteran. They had no idea they were witnessing a masterclass in manipulation by someone who'd never faced real danger in his privileged life. "The defense may cross-examine," Judge Patricia Hawkins announced, looking expectantly at Lisa Chen. Chen stood slowly, glancing at Samuel, who had explicitly told her not to attack Derek's character. "Your Honor, the defense has no questions at this time." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Hawkins looked surprised. "Ms. Chen, are you certain? This is your opportunity to challenge the witness's testimony." Samuel leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer. She nodded reluctantly and sat back down. "No questions, Your Honor." Derek smirked as he left the witness stand, making eye contact with Samuel as if to say, "That's what you get." His father, sitting in the front row, smiled proudly. Justice was working exactly as it was supposed to. District Attorney Foster called Officer Mills to the stand next. Mills testified about Samuel's aggressive posture and threatening demeanor during the arrest. He described Samuel as uncooperative and potentially dangerous, though he admitted Samuel had never resisted arrest or raised his voice. "In your professional opinion," Foster asked, "did the defendant pose a threat to public safety?" "Absolutely," Mills replied confidently. Veterans like him, they carry a lot of anger. Sometimes they take it out on innocent people. Mills had no idea that Samuel had been watching him testify with the same analytical calm he'd once used to assess enemy positions through a rifle scope. The prosecution rested. The defense called no witnesses. Samuel Washington, Master Chief Petty Officer, Navy SEAL, Purple Heart recipient, remained silent as his character was systematically dismantled by people who had never sacrificed anything for their country. But 300 miles away, a black SUV was already moving through heavy traffic on Interstate 65, heading south toward Mobile. The driver wore 4 stars on his shoulder and carried a phone that had been buzzing all morning with calls from old comrades who'd seen the news coverage. General Marcus Thompson hadn't spoken to Samuel Washington in over a decade, but some debts could never be forgotten. The jury deliberated for exactly 47 minutes. Judge Hawkins called them back into the courtroom as Samuel sat with the same steady composure he'd maintained throughout the trial. Lisa Chen fidgeted with her pen, knowing she'd failed her client but unsure how to fix it. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Hawkins asked. The foreman, a middle-aged insurance agent named Robert Cruz, stood with a folded paper in his hand. "We have, Your Honor." Samuel didn't look at the jury. He kept his eyes focused on a spot just above the judge's head, the same 1,000-yard stare that had once helped him track targets across impossible distances. He'd accepted this outcome the moment Derek Phillips had taken the stand. Some battles were lost before they were fought. In the case of the state of Alabama versus Samuel Washington on the charge of disturbing the peace, how do you find? "Guilty, Your Honor." On the charge of threatening behavior? "Guilty." Derek Phillips pumped his fist quietly. His father nodded with satisfaction. Officer Mills straightened his tie, another successful arrest on his record. District Attorney Foster began organizing her papers, already thinking about her next case. Judge Hawkins looked at Samuel with something that might have been regret. "Mr. Washington, you have been found guilty on both counts. Sentencing will be—" The courtroom doors opened with a quiet but unmistakable authority. Every head turned as a man in an immaculate military uniform walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. 4 silver stars gleamed on his shoulder. His bearing commanded instant respect from everyone in the room, even those who didn't understand military protocol. General Marcus Thompson hadn't come to observe. He'd come to correct a grave injustice that was about to become irreversible. And, as he approached the bench, Samuel Washington looked up for the first time since the trial began, his weathered face showing the faintest hint of recognition. General Thompson walked with the measured precision of someone accustomed to commanding rooms simply by entering them. The bailiff instinctively stood straighter. Judge Hawkins rose from her bench, recognizing the significance of 4-star rank, even if she didn't understand what was happening. "Your Honor," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction, "I respectfully request permission to address this court regarding the character and service record of Master Chief Petty Officer Samuel Washington." District Attorney Foster shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The trial is concluded. The jury has rendered its verdict." General Thompson turned his steady gaze toward Foster. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this court is about to sentence a man whose service record remains classified at the highest levels. Before that happens, I believe the court deserves to know exactly who Samuel Washington is." Judge Hawkins looked between the general and the prosecutor, clearly out of her depth. "General Thompson, while I appreciate your position, I'm not sure what authority—" "The authority of truth, Your Honor," Thompson interrupted gently, "and the authority of a debt that can never be repaid." Samuel watched this exchange with growing unease. He'd spent 30 years trying to disappear into civilian life, avoiding exactly this kind of attention. He'd never wanted his service record to become a shield against consequences. But as he looked at Marcus Thompson, the young lieutenant he'd once pulled from a burning Humvee in Fallujah, he realized that some stories demand to be told. "I'll allow it," Judge Hawkins said finally, "but please be brief, General." Derek Phillips looked confused, glancing at his father for guidance. Officer Mills shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The jury, who had been preparing to leave, now sat transfixed as one of the highest-ranking military officers in the country, prepared to speak on behalf of the man they'd just convicted. General Thompson nodded once, then turned to face the courtroom with the gravity of someone about to reveal a truth that would change everything. General Thompson stood before the jury box with his hands clasped behind his back, his voice clear and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is General Marcus Thompson, United States Marine Corps. 27 years ago, I was a second lieutenant, leading my first patrol in Fallujah, Iraq. I was 23 years old, convinced I knew everything about warfare, and absolutely certain I was invincible." The courtroom was dead silent. Even Derek Phillips had stopped smirking. Our convoy hit an IED en route Michigan. My Humvee flipped, caught fire, and I was trapped inside with a concussion and a broken leg. My radio operator was unconscious and bleeding. The insurgents who had set the trap were already moving in to finish us off. Thompson paused, his eyes finding Samuel in the defendant's chair. We had maybe 30 seconds before they reached us. Judge Hawkins leaned forward, completely absorbed. Lisa Chen had stopped taking notes. Then I heard a rifle crack from approximately 800 meters away. Then another, and another. 12 precise shots in under 4 minutes, each one eliminating a threat I couldn't even see. Whoever was providing overwatch was picking off insurgents from positions I didn't know existed, clearing a path for our rescue team to reach us. Officer Mills looked pale. The jury foreman, Robert Cruz, was staring at Samuel with growing recognition. I found out later that our guardian angel was a Navy SEAL sniper who had been tracking a high-value target in the area. Master Chief Samuel Washington had a choice that day. He could continue his mission, or he could save 2 Marines he'd never met. He chose to save us. Thompson's voice carried the weight of absolute gratitude. The target he was tracking escaped. His mission was compromised. But 2 American servicemen came home to their families because Samuel Washington decided that lives mattered more than objectives. Derek Phillips was no longer looking confident. His father had stopped smiling. "But that's not the end of the story," Thompson continued. 3 months later, that same high-value target was planning an attack on a forward operating base that housed over 200 American soldiers. Samuel Washington tracked him for 6 days through some of the most dangerous territory in Iraq. When he finally had his shot, it was a moving target at 1,247 meters in crosswind conditions that would challenge any shooter in the world. The general turned to look directly at Samuel. 1 shot, 1 kill. He saved those 200 lives with the same precision he'd used to save mine. Samuel had never told anyone about that mission. It remained classified. But Marcus Thompson had followed his career from afar, reading every after-action report, watching a legend quietly build a reputation that would never be publicly acknowledged. "The man you just convicted," Thompson said, turning back to the jury, "is responsible for saving the lives of over 300 American service members during his career. He has never asked for recognition. He has never sought publicity. He served his country for 26 years and came home to live quietly among the people he'd spent his life protecting." District Attorney Foster was frantically whispering to her assistant. This was not how routine convictions were supposed to go. "So, when I heard that Master Chief Washington had been accused of threatening someone," Thompson said, his voice carrying a note of steel, "I knew there had to be more to the story, because the Samuel Washington I know would rather die than harm an innocent person, and the Samuel Washington who saved my life would never use his training to intimidate civilians." The courtroom erupted in whispers. One juror was wiping away tears. Another shook his head in obvious regret. Judge Hawkins called for order, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. The atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Derek Phillips sat frozen, realizing that his carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time. "General Thompson," Judge Hawkins said carefully, "while this testimony is certainly illuminating, the jury has already rendered its verdict based on the evidence presented." "Your Honor," Thompson replied, "I respectfully suggest that the evidence was incomplete." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I have here Master Chief Washington's complete service record, recently declassified at my request. With the court's permission, I'd like to submit it as evidence that speaks directly to the defendant's character." District Attorney Foster was on her feet. "Objection. This is highly irregular. The trial has concluded." But Judge Hawkins was already reaching for the folder. As she opened it and began reading, her expression changed dramatically. Purple Heart, Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V for Valor. The decorations went on for pages, each one representing moments when Samuel Washington had chosen duty over safety, service over self. "Mr. Phillips," Judge Hawkins said suddenly, turning toward Derek, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to consider your answer very carefully. Is there anything about your testimony that you would like to revise?" Derek looked at his father, then at his lawyer, then at General Thompson, who was watching him with the steady gaze of someone who had spent years distinguishing truth from deception. I don't understand what you mean, Your Honor." "I think you do," Judge Hawkins replied, "because I'm looking at the service record of a man who has dedicated his life to protecting others and trying to reconcile that with someone who would threaten a civilian over a parking space." Samuel Washington sat silently through this exchange, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. He had never wanted his service record to become his defense. He had simply wanted to fade into the background and live his remaining years in peace. General Thompson walked to the center of the courtroom, his presence commanding everyone's attention. "Your Honor, I have one more thing to say, and then I'll let the court proceed as it sees fit." He turned to face Samuel Washington directly. "Master Chief, you don't know this, but I've been following your case since the moment I heard about it. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing security footage from the gas station where this incident occurred." Derek Phillips went rigid. His father started to stand, then thought better of it. "The footage shows Mr. Phillips verbally abusing the gas station attendant, using language I won't repeat in this courtroom. It shows Master Chief Washington approaching calmly and asking Mr. Phillips to treat the employee with respect. And it shows Mr. Phillips escalating the confrontation while Master Chief Washington repeatedly attempted to de-escalate." District Attorney Foster was frantically shuffling papers, looking for a way to object to evidence she hadn't seen. "The footage also shows," Thompson continued, "that when Mr. Phillips got in Master Chief Washington's face and challenged him to do something about it, the Master Chief simply stepped back and walked away. Mr. Phillips followed him, continuing to shout insults and racial slurs until Master Chief Washington finally said, and I quote, 'Son, you're making a mistake you can't take back.'" The jury was staring at Derek Phillips with growing disgust. Several jurors were shaking their heads. "That's not a threat," Thompson said firmly. "That's wisdom from a man who has seen what real violence looks like and was trying to prevent a young fool from crossing a line he'd regret for the rest of his life." Judge Hawkins set down the service folder and removed her glasses. "Mr. Phillips, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you wish to revise your testimony?" Derek's lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear. His father had his head in his hands. The weight of 300 eyes was bearing down on him as the truth became undeniable. I may have misremembered some details," Derek stammered. "Did Master Chief Washington threaten you?" Judge Hawkins asked directly. A long silence stretched across the courtroom. Finally, Derek shook his head. "No, ma'am, he didn't." General Thompson nodded once, then did something that stunned everyone in the room. He walked over to Samuel Washington, came to attention, and rendered a crisp military salute to the man who had saved his life 27 years earlier. Samuel slowly rose from his chair and returned the salute, two warriors acknowledging a debt that could never be fully repaid. Judge Hawkins stood slowly, her voice carrying the weight of institutional correction. "In light of the new evidence presented and the witness's revised testimony, this court hereby vacates the guilty verdict against Samuel Washington on all charges." The gavel came down with the sound of justice finally being served. Spontaneous applause erupted from the gallery as people realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. But Judge Hawkins wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I want to address this court and everyone present. Today, we were all reminded of the danger of assumptions, the power of prejudice, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. Master Chief Washington, on behalf of this court and this community, I offer you our sincere apology." Samuel nodded with quiet dignity, accepting the apology without bitterness or triumph. He had never sought vindication, only truth. Officer Mills approached the defense table, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Master Chief, I'm sorry. I should have looked deeper into what happened. I should have asked better questions." Samuel shook Mills's offered hand. "Officer, you did your job as you understood it. Now you know better. That's what matters." District Attorney Foster gathered her papers with visible shame. She had built a career on reading people and situations, and she had been completely wrong about Samuel Washington. As she passed the defense table, she stopped. "Master Chief, I owe you an apology as well. I allowed assumptions to guide my prosecution instead of facts." "Ma'am," Samuel replied gently, "we all make mistakes. The measure of a person isn't whether they stumble, but whether they learn from it." Derek Phillips remained in his seat, staring at his hands. His father had already left the courtroom, unable to face the consequences of his son's lies. Derek's expensive lawyer was packing his briefcase, his retainer already spent on a case that had become indefensible. General Thompson waited until the formal proceedings concluded, then approached Samuel with the respect due a fellow warrior. "Master Chief, I know you value your privacy, but I hope you understand why I had to speak." Samuel clasped Thompson's hand firmly. "Some truths need to be told, General. Thank you for having the courage to tell this one." As the courtroom emptied, Samuel Washington walked out the same doors he had entered in chains. But now he walked as a free man whose service and character had been publicly acknowledged. The afternoon sun felt warmer on his face as he stepped into a world that finally saw him for who he truly was. Samuel Washington didn't give interviews after his vindication. He didn't seek publicity or demand apologies from those who had judged him wrongly. He simply returned to his quiet life, walking the same route every morning, maintaining the same dignified bearing that had carried him through decades of service. But something had changed in Mobile. People began to notice the elderly black man who walked with military precision through their neighborhoods. They learned his name. They learned his story. And they began to understand that heroes don't always wear uniforms or carry fanfare. Sometimes they live quietly among us, carrying their service like a private honor, asking for nothing more than the respect due to any human being. Sometimes they endure our assumptions and prejudices with grace, waiting patiently for truth to surface in its own time.